Hi there. My name is Helen Rhodes. I'm 74 years old, and for most of my life I believed being a good mother meant showing up no matter what. But this past Christmas, I stood at my daughter's front door holding a gift for my grandson, and she looked me in the eye and said, "We don't want you here." That was the moment I realized sometimes even the people you gave everything to can forget you completely, and that kind of silence, it stays with you. "We don't want you here." My daughter's voice, flat and firm, was colder than the snow beneath my boots. The night had promised warmth. Not in temperature, it was December in Vermont after all, but in the hopeful pull of a handwritten card. "Lucas misses you, Helen. It would mean a lot if you came." Graham had written in his careful script, a red envelope, no return address, just my name, and a note I'd read over and over until it blurred. It had felt real enough to pack a suitcase. The porch steps creaked under my feet. Snow had piled into the corners like it had been waiting to claim forgotten things. I adjusted the scarf navy wool, fraying at the edges that I'd meant to give Lucas. He'd outgrown the one I made him 3 winters ago. I told myself this one would fit this one he would wear. Inside, through the frosted glass, yellow light glowed like butter melting on bread. A tree flickered in the background ornaments, catching reflections of a life that for years no longer included me. I saw Jessica move across the room. She didn't notice me at first. Or maybe she did. I pressed the doorbell. Moments passed. Then she appeared, hair perfectly straight, lips set. Her hand on the knob moved without hesitation. The door cracked open, letting out a gust of warmth that didn't reach me. "We don't want you here." Just that. Not even my name. My fingers tightened on the paper bag. Inside was the scarf, a snow globe I'd kept since Jessica was 9, and a photo of Lucas from last spring that I'd found online and printed. I'd put it in an old brass frame with a chipped corner, one Jessica used to polish every Sunday as a child. "I just brought a few things for Lucas," I said. My voice didn't tremble. Not out loud, at least. Jessica didn't reply. She stepped back and pulled the door closed behind her. No slam, just done. For a moment I stayed there. The light through the glass panel behind her moved faintly, like fireflies trapped in ice. My eyes adjusted, and I saw Lucas, just a flash of his round face pressed near the window, a small hand on the glass. But no one called him back. The click of the lock was soft, but final. Graham appeared then, breath visible in the cold. He pulled on a jacket, clearly rushed. "Helen, wait. I didn't know Jessica didn't." He looked helpless. I raised one hand. "Don't," I said. Not this time. The driveway hadn't been shoveled fully, and my boots sank into the edge of the drift. I nearly lost my footing, but I steadied myself before he could reach me. He hovered behind me, unsure. "I just wanted to drop this off," I said, not turning. My voice felt borrowed, calm, in a way only deep hurt knows. I opened the passenger door of the rented sedan. The heater had long since gone cold. I placed the bag gently on the seat. The brass frame peeked out face down as if shielding itself from the evening. I turned the key in the ignition. As I backed out of the drive, I caught one final glimpse of the porch light. It flickered slightly in the wind, then steadied. The last thing I saw was the gift bag, its tissue paper crumpled slightly. The photo frame had shifted forward in the curve of the seat. My face, caught in the reflection, looked almost like a stranger's, older, sharper, still standing. I drove off slowly, wheels crunching against the frozen gravel. I didn't look back. I once cleaned dental offices at midnight, so my daughter could wear the same shoes as her classmates. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and damp carpet. Helen hadn't turned on the television or touched the folded towel shaped like a swan on the bed. She had sat unmoving since she returned the night before, still in the same coat with her gloves untouched on the dresser. The sky outside was beginning to pale, a thin ribbon of cold light slicing through the slatted blinds. Christmas morning. The station was just across the street, but the trains wouldn't start again for hours. She didn't plan to take one yet. Beside her sat the gift bag, the same one she had retrieved from the passenger seat with stiff fingers. She hadn't looked inside since last night. Now she reached for it. The scarf came out first navy, soft, familiar. She had knitted it during the long autumn evenings when the fireplace in her rental unit crackled louder than the phone ever rang. Lucas had always liked blue. She held it against her lap, then gently folded it. Next, the snow globe, still cold to the touch. Inside, a small red house was nestled under plastic flurries, almost too cheerful. Jessica had once loved these things, had pressed her nose against department store windows, asking to shake everyone. Helen smiled without meaning to. Then the envelope, still sealed, still stamped with a forever stamp marked by a cartoon bear, and the words, "Thinking of you," postmarked 2016. Her handwriting on the front was elegant, but slightly uneven. She had never sent it. Her fingers hesitated before sliding it underneath the others. Not yet. She pulled out the photograph. Jessica 16, in a homecoming dress that Helen had worked 3 extra shifts to buy. The girl had beamed hair curled into glossy rings, eyes brighter than Helen remembered most days now. Behind the image, a note. She said she loved me most when I let her go. Helen placed the photo next to the scarf. Then she stared forward into nothing. The silence of the room allowed her mind to slip backward into the long corridors of memory. She remembered those late nights walking home from her hospital shift, changing into janitor's scrubs in the back of the clinic. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of vending machines, the small bottle of hand lotion she kept in her locker for the calluses. All so, Jessica could have field trip fees, brand shoes, school photos. Helen had never once asked her daughter to say thank you. The first time something shifted, it had been subtle. Jessica's baby shower. There had been no invitation. Helen had seen the photos later, pink balloons, cupcakes, a wide smile on her daughter's face as she posed next to Vivian. Graham's mother had her arm around Jessica. Helen had stared at that photo longer than she wanted to admit, trying to read something kind in her daughter's expression. But she found nothing. After Lucas was born, Helen had tried again. Toys, clothes, a quilt stitched from pieces of Jessica's childhood dresses. The box had arrived on time-tracked and confirmed, but no message ever came. Later, she found the unopened package in a hallway closet when visiting briefly the following year. She remembered writing the letter that winter 2016. She was in bed, the heating broken her hands, trembling slightly. She had written anyway. If someday I no longer fit your picture, just know I never stopped holding you inside mine. She picked up the envelope again now. The glue was still intact, the corners curled from time. Her breath caught in her throat, dry from the motel heater. She opened it and reread the letter in silence. The words didn't sting anymore. They simply sat inside her. She folded the paper slowly and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she sat very still for a while, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for anyone to notice. And for the first time, she didn't wonder if she should send the letter to Jessica. She thought maybe she would send it to herself. Helen puts the letter in her pocket. For the first time, thinking about sending it not to Jessica, but to herself. Where's Grandma Helen? Lucas looked up from his plate, his fork paused mid-air. The kitchen was unusually quiet for Christmas morning. Outside, the snow had thickened, clinging to the window panes like lace, dimming what little light the sky could muster. The scent of roasted ham lingered in the air, though no one was eating with much appetite. Jessica stood at the sink, her hands moving mechanically over the same plate for too long. By the window, Graham stood with his arms crossed. He hadn't said much since last night, but his eyes were hollowed with things he hadn't yet decided to say. He had seen Helen walking away, not hurrying, not turning back, just stepping carefully across the snow as if it belonged to her now. Lucas repeated, "Where's Grandma Helen?" Jessica's hand faltered, and the plate slipped slightly under the water. She adjusted her grip. "I don't know, sweetheart. Let's focus on breakfast, okay?" Graham turned slightly. "Are you okay with what happened?" Jessica kept scrubbing. "I mean," he continued quieter, "now that was your mother. She knew she wasn't invited." Jessica said more to the sink than to anyone in the room. From the corner, a voice cut cleanly through the thick air. "She made her bed," Vivian said. Her tone was clipped, unbothered. That woman never knew her place, always clinging to old emotions like they were some sort of currency. She reached for a piece of toast, bit into it crisply. This house has its own rhythm now, its own structure. She would only complicate things. Jessica dried her hands and sat down, her face unreadable. Lucas, still holding his fork, had stopped eating altogether. "But I drew her something," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to give it to her last night, but then the door closed too fast." He laid the folded paper carefully on the table. No one moved. Graham sat down and leaned forward slowly. He opened the paper and studied the drawing. Crayon lines bright and earnest. 3 figures stood under falling snow. One tall with a scarf, one small in the middle, another with grey hair and a smile that stretched beyond the paper's edge. The words, "Grandma Helen Me," and "Snow." Jessica's gaze dropped to the picture. For just a breath, something shifted behind her eyes, an old softness, uncertain and unwelcome. But she said nothing. Vivian reached for more tea. "That's very sweet, Lucas," she said, not looking at the picture. "But it's time you understand. Some doors once closed should stay closed." The room held stillness like a second skin. Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he pushed the picture closer to his father. "Can we mail it to her?" Vivian opened her mouth, but Graham spoke first. "We'll see," he said gently, then folded the paper again with care. He looked over at Jessica, who didn't look up, and then without ceremony slipped the drawing into the inside pocket of his cardigan. No one noticed. Some doors once closed should stay closed. Graham quietly puts the drawing in his pocket. No one notices. No one told me to leave. But no one asked me to stay either. The room was quiet. Not heavy, just quiet. No thudding feet overhead, no television murmurs, no dishes clinking in the sink. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from the absence of expectation. The light through the frosted window pane had barely shifted since dawn. It was still that faint grey blue that winter wears on its laziest days. Outside, a snowplow passed with a distant hum, stirring up a flurry that quickly settled again. Helen moved slowly across the room, folding the navy scarf back into the gift bag. She added the snow globe, nestled it between 2 layers of tissue, and placed the letter on top. The same one she'd nearly mailed years ago. She didn't write Jessica's name on the envelope. She didn't need to. On a small notepad from the nightstand, she scribbled another note in her steadier hand. "You don't need to let me in, but I won't let myself disappear." She slid that note inside the gift bag too, and folded the handles closed. Later that morning, she walked the short distance from the motel to the nearby post office, not to mail anything, but to leave the bag on the porch outside behind the decorative bench next to the snow-covered shrubs. Jessica would see it, or Graham would. That was enough. When she returned to the room, her cheeks pink from the cold, the air inside felt warmer by contrast. She peeled off her gloves, then her coat, and sat on the bed with her old flip phone resting in her lap. She opened it. A single unread message blinked softly. From Graham. Just a few words, I'm sorry. She didn't mean to say it like that. Lucas misses you. Helen stared at the screen for a long while. Then she pressed clear. Not in anger, just in clarity. She scrolled through the contacts. Most names had long since faded from relevance. Some were gone entirely. But one Nina Bell remained nestled between Neighbours Old and Pharmacy. She selected the name and hit call. The ringing sounded hollow at first, like calling into a cave. Then click. Helen. The voice was slower than she remembered, but unmistakable. Is it really you? Helen swallowed. Yes, I wasn't sure if this was still your number. There was a pause, a soft inhale. I kept what you sent me, Nina said. All of it. I always knew one day you'd call. And it's time. Helen sat up a little straighter, hand tightening on the edge of the bedspread. She hadn't realized how hunched she'd become. Something in her spine clicked quietly back into place. Just a little. They spoke only a few more minutes, familiar but cautious. Time had stretched the thread between them, but hadn't cut it. When she hung up, Helen looked around the room. Same yellowed curtains, same dented radiator. But somehow, the stillness had shifted. She pulled her old leather bag from the closet and began folding a sweater into it, then another. She paused once to look in the mirror, not out of vanity, just to be sure she still looked like someone worth moving forward. Later that afternoon at the front desk, the landlady looked up from her crossword puzzle. Going somewhere, Ms. Rhodes Helen smiled softly. Just a short trip. The woman nodded without prying. Snow's thick on the roads tomorrow. You heading out early? Yes, Helen said, tucking the confirmation printout into her coat. There's a bus to New Hampshire at 7:15. Family there? A friend? The landlady smiled gently. Sometimes that's better. Helen returned the smile, then stepped back out into the cold. The light was still pale, but it felt different now. Helen booked a bus to New Hampshire early the next morning. You once said I should hold on to it just in case. I did. The words hung in the air as Helen stepped across the threshold, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a shawl. Cinnamon wood smoke and something floral lavender perhaps coated the room in a kind of memory she couldn't quite name. Nina Bell stood at the door, holding her by the shoulders, before pulling her into a firm, wordless embrace. Neither woman rushed the moment. They hadn't seen each other in 6 years, or maybe more. The time had become a blur measured more in holidays missed than calendars turned. Helen let herself exhale. The house hadn't changed much. Oak beams, overstuffed chairs, tea mugs on crocheted coasters. Outside the window, the lake sat frozen, the kind of stillness that only winter could teach. They said very little as coats were hung and tea was made. It wasn't awkward. It was a kind of seasoned quiet, the kind you share with people who once helped you carry the weight of your worst days. In the small sitting room, Nina set down a wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, but heavier in its silence. You sent this in 2016, Nina said, running her fingers across the lid. You said, if anything ever changes, I want one person to remember I existed on paper. Helen reached for the box, but hesitated. Her fingers curled slightly, paused in midair. I didn't think I'd ever ask for it back, she said. But you did ask me to keep it, Nina replied, lifting the lid. Inside were a few folded letters yellowing at the edges. Underneath them, an envelope sealed in red wax, unbroken, and a photocopy with official letterhead Bernard Katz-esque. Family Legal Services, Seattle, WA. Nina slid the photocopy across the table. Helen picked it up slowly. Her eyes scanned the opening paragraph. This document affirms that Mrs. Helen Margaret Rhodes shall be recognized as the primary occupant and decision-maker of the family property at 214 Greystone Lane for the duration of her natural life, unless by voluntary departure, and not subject to removal without due legal process. Her breath hitched. Nina reached for her hand. You told me Daniel started behaving strangely after Robert passed, that he mentioned selling the house even before probate cleared. Helen nodded, voice thick. That's when I asked Bernard to draft this, just in case. But then everything went quiet, and I started to believe I had imagined it all. But you didn't, Nina said. You were never wrong to stay. Helen stared at her name, crisp in black ink, right there on the page. Not erased, not replaced, not forgotten. A long, silent tear slid down her cheek. For years, she whispered, I felt like I was squatting in my own memory. Nina squeezed her hand. Now you remember the truth. They sat like that for a while, letting the warmth of the room seep into the cracks time had made. Later that evening, Helen sat at the small desk by the window. A lamp cast a cone of light across the paper as she wrote, Dear Bernard, if this still holds weight, I am ready to use it, not to reclaim, but to remain. Warmly, Helen Margaret Rhodes. She folded the letter neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it with steady hands. Nina came in with a fresh cup of tea. Done? She asked. Helen nodded. I don't know what this will change, but it's the first thing I've done in years that feels like it belongs to me. Nina smiled. That's enough. Outside, the snow fell again. But inside, a door was finally opening. Helen writes to Katz. If this still holds weight, I am ready to use it. Not to reclaim, but to remain. She never left your side that week. She sang through the seizures. The small mountain church looked like something carved out of time. Its faded blue stained glass filtered the winter sunlight into soft puddles of colour across the wooden floor. Snow still lay quietly along the edges of the stone path, melting slowly in the noon warmth of December 26th. Helen stepped inside without knocking. The door gave a soft creak that echoed lightly through the open nave. Empty wooden chairs stretched out like sentinels facing the modest altar. A gentle tune drifted from the rear, someone playing an old upright piano with a patience that didn't seek applause. She followed the sound. Reverend Thomas Keller looked up from the keys as she entered. The lines in his face had deepened, but his eyes hadn't changed a mild, steady grey, like overcast skies that never threatened storm. Helen Rhodes, he said, rising slowly. I always wondered when you'd walk back through this door. She smiled just slightly. I wasn't sure anyone would remember. The nurse, who always sat in the last pew, who refused to stand during hymns because her knees ached, but still sang under her breath. He chuckled. I remember. They sat near the front, not in the pews, but on two simple chairs. The light landed gently on Helen's lap, warming her fingers. It was the kind of light that made even old wood look golden. I didn't come for prayer, she said softly. I didn't think you did, Keller replied. But you might find some anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Keller leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You know he began one night. Jessica must have been 7. She had a fever that wouldn't break. Convulsions. I came by the hospital around 3 a.m. to give last rites to someone else. I stopped by her room on my way out. Helen looked down, lips pressed tight. You were there, he said. Asleep in the chair, one hand on her forehead. You'd been singing, I could tell. Her breathing had softened like a child being rocked in a cradle. "I don't remember that night," Helen whispered. "I do," Keller said. "And I remember thinking that is what love looks like when no one's watching." Helen blinked quickly, trying to dislodge something behind her eyes. Was I... She hesitated too much. Keller smiled. "You were constant, and people forget the solid things. They always remember the noise." The silence wrapped around them again, not empty, but full. "I've been shut out," she finally said. "Told I no longer fit. That I confuse the way their house works now." Keller's expression grew still. "If your daughter's house has no room," he said slowly, "maybe it's because they've built it without remembering the foundation." Helen inhaled sharp and low. "I don't want to knock any more," she said after a while, "but I do want to leave a key. Something that says I was here, that I mattered." Keller nodded. "You already have." He walked her to the back, where a bench sat beneath the stained glass that showed a tree growing out of stone. He placed his hand on her shoulder, then lightly to her forehead. No words, no ritual, just memory resting gently like a blessing. Outside, the snow continued to melt, drop by drop. "I don't want to knock any more, but I do want to leave a key." "Why is Grandma not in any of these pictures?" Lucas's voice rang with the kind of innocence that made adults uncomfortable. He stood on the carpet in Jessica's living room, a stack of photo albums splayed out like a card game, his finger tapping a glass frame mounted carefully on the family photo wall. Sunlight spilled across the polished wood floors. Outside, the snow had started to melt, dripping from the gutters in soft, rhythmic intervals. Jessica turned from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel that was already damp. "Sweetheart, those are just recent pictures." "But Grandma was there before." "Right," Lucas asked. "Like before I was born," Graham looked up from his chair. He'd been nursing the same lukewarm coffee since morning, saying little since breakfast. Now his gaze lingered on the wall. "Jessica, he said he's not wrong." Jessica hesitated, then walked over, crouching beside Lucas. She opened one of the older albums. The pages were neatly organized: holidays, birthdays, Lucas's baby photos. Everything was labeled. Everything was in its place. Except one thing. There was no Helen. Lucas pointed again. "This is the Christmas where I got the snowman, right? Didn't Grandma give me that?" Jessica stiffened. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned another page. A group photo, her wedding day. But the image was smaller than she remembered. Graham reached over. This used to be wider. Jessica looked closer. There along the edge of the photo, just at the border of the crowd, was a jagged line. A cut. Clean and deliberate. Helen had been in the original. Jessica's face froze, then slackened. Her eyes filled. She hadn't remembered doing this. Or maybe she had, and had buried the knowing. "She was there," Graham said quietly. "You can't erase that. Who are you protecting him?" He nodded toward Lucas. "Or yourself." Vivian stepped in from the hallway, arms crossed, expression rigid. "Photos are about the present," she said sharply. "Don't drag everyone back into sadness just because you're feeling guilty." Jessica didn't answer. Her gaze fell back to the cut edge of the photo. Her mother had stood there smiling, holding a cup of cider, laughing. Jessica had worn blue that day. Something Helen had said brought out the green in her eyes. She blinked. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching her by surprise. Lucas climbed onto the couch beside her. He held something out, a small, unframed photo. Helen younger, holding Jessica on her hip. The child version of herself had her arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. "I found this in the box under the stairs," Lucas said. "It doesn't have a frame, but it's nice." Jessica reached out with both hands and took the photo. She stared at it for a long moment, her lips trembling. No one spoke. Finally, with slow and deliberate care, she folded the photo in half, not to destroy it, but to keep it safe. She slipped it into her sweater pocket like something precious. Then she stood and said nothing. Vivian exhaled, annoyed. Graham just watched. Outside, the melting snow continued to drip one drop at a time, reshaping the world. Jessica quietly takes an unframed photo, her mother holding her as a child, and puts it away in her pocket. "Mum, this says Grandma Helen. Why is it in the attic?" Lucas's voice floated down from the ceiling like a drop of cold water. Jessica, startled, looked up from the hallway closet where she was folding old scarves and mismatched gloves. She hadn't realized he'd gone up the narrow pull-down steps. The attic door had creaked open without her hearing it. "Lucas," she called. "Be careful. The boards up there are—" "I'm on the wood part," he replied. "But there's this box. It has her name." Jessica climbed the steps slowly. The attic was colder than she remembered, the air dry and dense with dust. She saw Lucas crouched near the back, where the insulation sagged behind old Christmas bins and forgotten luggage. He pointed to a box. The lid was only half closed. In her own handwriting, smudged with time, Helen. "Spring keepsakes." Jessica hesitated, then walked over and lowered herself beside it. She opened the flaps. A smell rose, mothballs and paper, familiar and old. Inside lay things she didn't remember packing. A folded quilt with tiny roses, one corner worn through. A blue notebook, edges curled. A Ziploc bag with faded baby socks and a small card. Lucas, month 3, slept through the night. Lucas reached in and pulled out a white handkerchief. His name was embroidered in soft blue thread, slightly crooked. "She made this?" he asked. Jessica nodded. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. At the bottom of the box lay an envelope still sealed. Her name written on the front, Jessica, if you want to remember. Her fingers hovered, then pulled the flap loose. The letter inside was dated 2016. She began to read. "My dear Jess, you were always in motion, even in sleep. I remember holding your legs still during fever nights, afraid you'd convulse right off the bed. I whispered stories into your hair. You never remembered them, but I did. I still do. If ever you forget I was your mother, just know I never forgot you were my daughter. Love, Mom." Jessica's breath caught. She gripped the edges of the envelope to steady her hands. The letter wasn't long, but it stretched through her like a thread that had never been cut, just buried. She pulled out the blue notebook next. On one page, in looping, tidy handwriting, Jessica, fever, Tuesday night. Woke up at 3:43 a.m., cried for 3 minutes, sang her back down. Temp 102.1. Each line was dated, each entry a small window. Toothaches, choir recitals, favourite lunches. She sat there in the dust, surrounded by evidence of a love that had never tried to be loud, only constant. Lucas had gone quiet beside her. She whispered the word before she even noticed her mouth had formed it. "Mom." It left her lips like a breath she didn't know she was holding. No accusation, no apology, just memory. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Vivian had left to meet a friend. Graham was in the backyard trimming branches. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, Jessica felt no pressure to explain herself. She pulled out her phone, scrolled down the contact list. The name hadn't been updated in a long time. It still read, Mom. She tapped it once. Her thumb hovered over the green call icon. She didn't press it, but she didn't delete it either. Instead, she tapped Edit, then changed nothing, only hit save. Jessica picks up the phone. taps on the name Mom, but doesn't call, just saves the old name. I no longer expect a seat at your table, but there will always be one at mine. Jessica read the line once, then again, slower. She hadn't expected the envelope to carry weight. It was thin, the paper inside light, but somehow it rested in her palm, as if soaked with years. The morning was pale. Snow still clung to the porch railings, but the sun was rising behind the trees, turning the edges of the icicles into melting light. In the kitchen, Jessica stirred her coffee, though she'd forgotten to add sugar. Her hands trembled faintly as the spoon clicked against porcelain. Lucas entered, clutching something between his fingers. "I found this in the drawer," he said, holding it up. "It has your name." Jessica turned. The envelope was cream-coloured, slightly bent. Her name written in blue ink. No return address, no date. Lucas tilted it toward her. It was with the stamps. She took it, without a word. He watched her for a moment, then drifted to the window, tracing his finger on the foggy glass. Jessica opened the flap slowly. The paper was folded twice, no creases worn in. She unfolded it and began to read lips, moving without sound. "Jessica, I'm not writing to return. I'm writing so you know I left whole. I will always be Lucas's grandmother, even if I'm not in the picture frame. I once stayed up 87 nights through your illnesses. I remember each one. You don't need to let me in. But I won't let myself vanish. Mum." Jessica's throat tightened. She reached for her coffee, but her hand missed the cup. It tipped a thin spill, pooling across the counter. She didn't react. Lucas turned. "Are you okay?" She nodded once, but her chest said otherwise. There was no anger in the letter, no plea, just quiet, undeniable presence. She could hear her mother's voice, tired, patient, never raised. She saw those old hands buttoning her coat when she was 8, holding a flashlight while she read, untying her ice skates after practice. So much had been done without witness, and so little had been remembered fairly. Jessica folded the letter slowly and placed it beside the spilled coffee, where the paper absorbed the moisture at its edges like it too could feel. She stood, took a breath. Her eyes burned, but the tears came more gently this time. Not in shame, just weight. She turned to Lucas. "Go get your boots." He blinked. "What?" She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair, stuffing gloves into the pockets. "We're going to find Grandma." Lucas's eyes lit up. "Really? Where is she?" Jessica shook her head. "I don't know where she went." She paused, looking toward the window, where the snow was melting in thin streaks beneath the sun's first full rays. "But I know where she might still be waiting. Jessica. I don't know where she went, but I know where she might still be waiting. She left quietly, but she left everything in order." The receptionist at Bernard Katz's law office adjusted her glasses as Helen approached the counter. Helen's boots were dusted in dry salt from the walk, and her coat, though neatly buttoned, still carried the scent of pine from Nina's fireplace. "I have an appointment," Helen said, placing a manila envelope on the desk. "For Mr. Katz. He'll know what it's about." The woman nodded, taking the envelope carefully, noting the firm handwriting on the front. "For Bernard Katz. Personal." Helen stepped back and waited in the corner where the wood-panelled walls muted every sound. The office was quiet, too quiet for Manhattan, and the frosted glass doors allowed only soft light to stretch into the waiting room. After a few minutes, Katz appeared. Tall grey at the temples, glasses resting low on his nose. He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed as they met Helen's. "Helen Rhodes," he said, as though speaking to a memory. "It's been a long time." She nodded. "I've only come to return what still bears my name." They entered his office, where a mahogany desk separated them, but not unkindly. Helen placed the envelope on the desk and gently slid it forward. Inside were 3 documents, a notarized copy of the 2014 will letter of limited power of attorney from her late husband, and a handwritten note in blue ink. Katz opened the note first. "I do not ask to come back. I only ask to remain visible. I was once part of that house. I still am. HR." He folded it once and placed it beside the legal pages. "You're aware," he said, tapping the will, "that technically your name still grants you partial residency." Helen met his gaze. "That's enough for me." Katz leaned back. "You're not here to contest anything." "No," she said. "Only to make sure nothing is erased that shouldn't be." He nodded, once slow and respectful. "I'll preserve the file in our records. Should your daughter wish to reference it, she'll know where to look." Helen stood. Katz did not reach to shake her hand, but he inclined his head deeply as if in court. "Your husband would have been proud of your clarity." "I'm tired of silence," Helen replied. "But I'm not here to make noise, just to be heard if someone is still listening." She left the office with her coat still buttoned, steps steady. An hour later, Jessica entered the same lobby. Lucas stayed downstairs with Graham, colouring in a waiting room, while she took the elevator up alone. The receptionist looked up. "Miss Jessica Rhodes." Jessica gave a slight nod. "You're expected. Mr. Katz has left some documents for you." Inside the office, Katz greeted her with a thin folder. "Your mother was here this morning," he said, without preamble. Jessica opened the folder. At the top, in her mother's looping script, was the handwritten note. Below it, the will, her father's signature faint now but still legal, and Helen's clear and strong. She didn't want to claim the house, Katz said quietly. She only wanted to make sure her name didn't vanish from it. Jessica sat down slowly, the folder resting in her lap like a weight. Her fingers traced the inked name at the bottom of the will. Helen Margaret Rhodes. Still there. Not bold, not demanding, but present. Jessica holds the documents, her hands shaking. Katz looks at her. She never intended to fight, only to be remembered. So she thinks she can sneak back through a clause. Vivian stood at the edge of the living room, the manila envelope in her manicured hand. She hadn't even bothered to take off her coat. The December light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp stripes across her face. Jessica froze mid-step, the coffee mug trembling in her fingers. Graham looked up from the dining table where he'd just returned from unpacking the folder Helen left behind. Lucas was on the floor by the bookshelf, sketching a snowman with oversized mittens. He didn't look up, but Jessica knew he was listening. "She didn't sneak," Jessica said, her voice steady. "She followed the law. She left her name where it always belonged." Vivian's mouth twisted. She always had a way of returning without being invited. Graham stood. Helen never crashed through any doors. She knocked. She waited. She left when told. Jessica stepped forward, taking the folder back from Vivian's hand. "You erased her. In photos, in rooms, in memories." Vivian scoffed. "Don't start this again." "I already started it," Jessica said, quieter now. "When I let you tell me who she was." The air in the room thickened. The Christmas lights remained unplugged from the night before. No carols played. The tree in the corner stood mute and stiff, the garlands slightly askew. Vivian sat slowly, folding her gloves on her lap. "That document," she said, tilting her chin at the folder, "is sentimental. I could have it challenged. I could say she's not of sound mind." Graham crossed the room. "You'd lose." Vivian blinked. "Excuse me. Not in court, maybe. But you'd lose, Jessica. And you'd lose Lucas." Jessica didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Vivian looked from one to the other, then turned toward the boy still kneeling near the window. "Lucas," she called sweetly, "what do you think about all this fuss?" Lucas looked up, his eyes bright but unwavering. He walked toward the couch, holding a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for Grandma Helen," he said. Jessica bent to take it. A simple picture, two stick figures in the snow, one taller, one shorter, both wearing scarves. Above them, in big crayon letters, "I know you are real." Lucas looked straight at Vivian. "Grandma didn't ask to live here again. She just wanted me to know she was real." Silence fell like snow. Vivian said nothing. She gathered her gloves with slow precision, rose, and left the room. Her boots tapped once against the hardwood and then disappeared into the hallway. Jessica stood still for a long while. Then quietly, almost like a vow to herself, she whispered, "I'm writing her name back on the mailbox." Lucas's small fingers found hers. "It's snowing again." Good. She always loved walking in it. The bus driver adjusted the mirror and smiled faintly. Helen, seated in the third row from the front, nodded without responding. Her gloved hands rested atop the small cloth bag on her lap. Inside were only three things: the snowball paperweight, a neatly folded scarf, and her leather-bound notebook, now nearly full. Outside, the snow came gently without urgency. The roads were quiet, the world still wrapped in a post-holiday hush. As the bus pulled out of the edge of the Vermont town, Helen looked back one last time. The inn stood just as she had left it, shutters closed, smoke trailing from the chimney. She had slid the note under the front desk bell that morning before dawn. No signature, just 6 lines. "Thank you for letting me stay. I needed a place to listen to silence. It was louder than I expected, but kinder than I remembered. Please give the next guest room 3. It forgives gently." She turned back to the window. A child's laughter floated from 2 seats behind. A little girl in a red coat sat next to her grandmother, clutching a bag of tinsel. The older woman looked down at her granddaughter with the kind of gaze that needs no instruction, only time. Helen didn't smile, but her shoulders softened. She leaned back and closed her eyes. The hum of the engine vibrated faintly through the floor, like an old song. Wind touched the pane beside her, whispering across the glass, nudging a few stray strands of her silver hair. She didn't think of Jessica right away, or Vivian, or even Graham. She thought of Lucas, a warm blur in the memory, small hands, a crooked snowman drawing, the way he said real like it meant more than presents. Somewhere hours away, Jessica stood before the old memory box scarf, unfolded a photo of young Helen holding a younger daughter, now pressed flat between trembling fingers. The snowball she had left beside the envelope was still intact, its plastic dome catching the morning sun. Lucas, curious as ever, picked it up. "Mom?" he had asked. Jessica looked up. "I think Grandma left this for me." She nodded. He placed the snowball on the middle of the dining table, a table once declared off-limits to old memories, and gave it a gentle twist. The flakes inside danced, tiny, weightless, brief but persistent. Helen stirred on the bus as if hearing it. "I didn't win." She thought her eyes still closed, but I didn't vanish either. She pulled out her notebook and opened to the next empty page. Her pen moved slowly. 2812. Lucas knows. That was enough. "Do you think she'd come if I asked her?" Lucas sat cross-legged on the carpet, his chin resting on his hands, eyes fixed on the snowball still perched in the center of the table. The snow had settled again, frozen mid-whirl. Jessica looked up from the album in her lap and didn't answer right away. The morning light streamed in, soft and full, like a long-forgotten memory finally returned. For the first time in days, the clouds had lifted. The living room, usually dim in winter, now glowed. Dust swirled lazily through sunbeams. The heater hummed gently. On the floor beside Jessica were stacks of photographs, some faded at the corners, others sharply preserved. The edges of certain images had been cut neatly surgically, leaving blank spaces beside young faces. Hands without arms. A bouquet held by no one. Jessica's fingers hovered over one torn photo, her graduation. Helen once stood behind her, beaming in a pale blue dress. That piece was missing. She pulled out the drawer, the one she hadn't opened in years, and found a small envelope labeled Jessica's Things, 2002. Inside, folded carefully, was the missing sliver. Helen's smiling face, gently weathered eyes full of pride. Graham entered quietly, coffee in hand, and sat across from her. He didn't speak, only placed the envelope with the reprinted wedding photo on the table. Jessica slid the pieces together like a puzzle long overdue. "I want it printed," she said. "Big, like the others?" Graham nodded. They worked in silence. The printer's slow hum, the snip of scissors, the soft creak of the picture frame opening. It all felt ceremonial. Lucas came closer, watching with a kind of reverence children rarely hold for photographs. "Should I write something?" he asked. Jessica handed him a small card. Lucas took a crayon and, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth, wrote carefully, "Helen Rhodes, always a part of us." Jessica smiled, eyes wet but steady. She slipped the card into the frame just beneath the photo. She stood, walked to the wall beside the wedding portrait, where 3 generations of smiles paused in mid-laughter, and hung the new frame. It clicked softly into place. Behind her, Vivian stood by the doorway, arms folded. She didn't step in, didn't speak. Her eyes landed on the frame, flicked briefly to Lucas, then to Jessica. Jessica met her gaze. Vivian turned and walked away. No words were needed. Lucas stood beneath the photo hands in his pockets. "If she sees this," he said quietly, "will she know we mean it?" Jessica crouched beside him. "She will," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "Even if she never comes back." She walked like she had nowhere to be, but everything to leave behind. The neighbour had said it almost offhandedly, stirring sugar into her tea as the afternoon light poured across the kitchen counter. She passes by the forest edge sometimes, always alone. Just after lunch, when the light is thin and no one's out. She shrugged. Doesn't bother anyone. Just walks. Jessica looked out the window, the sun slicing across the bare trees beyond the hill. Lucas stood at the doorway holding the wool scarf she had retrieved from the memory box. He had taken to carrying it around the house lately, not wearing it, just holding it as if it still contained a shape, a smell, a whisper. "Let's go," he said quietly. They followed the old trail behind the town's edge past the fence line and through the dry crunch of last leaves that refused to be buried by snow. The air smelled of cedar and memory. Footprints dotted the thin crust of snow ahead, wide, deliberate steps made with a cane's aid. Recent, but not rushed. Jessica's fingers tightened around Lucas's hand. The path wound between ancient oaks, their bare branches forming a high, natural dome. The filtered sunlight slanted through painting gold across the forest floor. And then they saw her. Not clearly, just a shape at first. Grey cloak, the curve of her shoulders, the slow but steady rhythm of her walk. She did not look lost. She looked deliberate, as though she knew every tree by name. Lucas stopped. "She's here," he said. Jessica didn't move. The figure ahead paused. Helen turned slightly, not fully, just enough to see them. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. Instead, her hand rose gently to her chest, fingertips resting just above her heart, and then lowered again. A nod not of greeting, but of acknowledgement, of presence. Then she turned and continued walking. Lucas exhaled his breath, a thin cloud in the air. "She saw us," he said. Jessica nodded, eyes shimmering, and she chose to keep walking. She knelt beside him, brushed snow from the hem of his coat. "That's okay." They stood in silence for a while, watching the trail until the forest reclaimed it. By the time they turned to go, the sun had dipped lower, catching in the brittle edges of the trees. Lucas looked back once more, but Helen was no longer in sight. As they made their way home, shoes crunching softly through the snow, Jessica spoke not to Lucas, but perhaps to herself. "Let's put her name back on the mailbox. She used to say, 'You can't trap a snowfall, but you can honor it.'" The words came back to Jessica as she placed the teacups down the porcelain warm in her hands, despite the chill that lingered just outside the kitchen windows. The morning of January the 1st arrived quietly. No clinking glasses, no fireworks, just the soft hum of the heater and the occasional clatter of Lucas's pencil against the table. The snow globe remained where it had been for days now at the center of the dining table. Lucas never forgot. Each morning he turned it gently, his small fingers coaxing a quiet storm of white flakes inside the glass dome. Today was no different. He gave it a twist, and the snow danced again, as if starting anew, unbothered by time. Jessica and Graham moved slowly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast, without rush, without need for conversation. The atmosphere held a kind of warmth, though beneath it sat a quiet gap, not painful, not jarring but known, an empty chair acknowledged rather than filled. Lucas worked at the corner of the table with scissors tape and a sheet of folded paper. He leaned over his drawing tongue between his lips, deeply focused. The crayons lay scattered around him like petals. When he was done, he slid the paper to the middle of the table. "It's us," he said, "for New Year." Jessica leaned in. The picture showed the family gathered around a dinner table, all 4 chairs filled. She recognized herself, Graham with his glasses, Lucas in his red sweater. And at the head of the table, in soft grey strokes, sat Helen. Her face drawn with more care than detail, but unmistakable. A tiny hand was on the snow globe mid-turn, her shawl shaded with faint silver pencil. "I remember what she wore," Lucas said softly. "That grey shawl." Jessica's throat tightened. She reached beneath the table, opened the drawer where the memory box still rested, and pulled out the soft woolen scarf. It still smelled faintly of lavender and old winter. She wrapped it loosely and passed it to Lucas. "Wear this when you miss her," she whispered. "She'll feel it." Lucas took it carefully, like something sacred, and placed it gently around his shoulders. Graham said nothing, just walked over and pinned the drawing to the refrigerator door, just beside the calendar that still read December. Vivian walked through, then slowly arms crossed. She glanced at the drawing on the fridge and paused. Her eyes flicked across the table to the boy in the scarf, the woman watching the snow globe spin, and then to the picture, the quiet seat at the head, no longer empty. She said nothing. But she didn't look away. Outside, the snow had softened, just a glaze now melting at the edges. The light touched everything inside the kitchen, the photo frames, the cooling cups of tea, the hand-drawn family that had begun to find its shape again. Lucas turned to his mother. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Jessica looked at the snow globe still spinning slowly, then back to her son. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe she never left. I didn't need the chair. I just needed the room to exist." Helen sat quietly in the wooden bench at the edge of the station. The town hadn't changed, not in any of the ways that mattered. The platform stretched out before her, a few faded advertisements, flapping in the cold breeze. The distant hum of a freight train approaching slowly without urgency. In her lap, a single sheet of thick paper lined with faint blue, and her old fountain pen, the one she once used for holiday cards and bedtime notes. She wrote in slow, careful strokes, not for haste, not for delivery, simply because there were still things inside her that hadn't been said aloud, and that paper had always been patient. I didn't return to reclaim. I only left so you'd remember to ask who once lived in that room. The ink bled slightly at the corner where her hand trembled. She paused, then continued. My chair at your table will stay empty, but don't remove it. She folded the letter once, then twice. The envelope was already addressed to Jessica, no return name, just a faint sender's stamp. She placed it in the drop box near the ticket counter. Then she stepped back, watching the red flag lift gently to signal it had been received. Helen turned once to look at the sky. It was overcast, soft grey, with pale light breaking through. She didn't smile, but something in her posture relaxed, as though a burden had quietly settled into its proper place, no longer carried, but not forgotten. A week later, Jessica stood by the hallway mirror, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the floorboards. The mailbox key had felt unusually cold in her hand, but she'd opened the box anyway, almost out of habit. And there it was, a plain envelope, the handwriting immediately familiar. She didn't open it in the kitchen. She didn't call Graham. She sat alone by the window, her legs tucked under the soft wool blanket Helen had made years ago. The house was quiet. Even Lucas had fallen into the soft hum of sleep in the other room. The letter was brief. I didn't return to reclaim. I only left so you'd remember to ask who once lived in that room. My chair at your table will stay empty. But don't remove it. Jessica's fingers traced the last line again. Her hand trembled slightly, but no tears came this time. Only a nod. A deep, silent, aching nod. Graham had made tea earlier, his mug still on the counter, steam long gone. In a flicker of memory, she saw herself sitting beside him, handing him the same letter. He hadn't spoken. He'd only taken her hand. A rustle in the living room broke the stillness. Lucas stood barefoot near the table, rubbing his eyes. He reached for the snow globe and gave it a slow turn. The snow swirled inside like it always did, a miniature storm that settled again into calm. Lucas looked at her. She's still in the picture, right? Jessica looked around the dining table, the scarf on the back of the chair, the framed photo of 3 generations that now included Helen again. She always was, she said. And as the light shifted slightly, catching the curve of the globe's glass, a quiet came over the room, not of absence, but of something long overdue finding its rightful place. She was never invited back, but she was never forgotten again. What began as quiet erasure ended as a quiet reckoning, not with anger, but with the kind of truth that lingers in empty chairs and handwritten names. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to disappear to make an entire family remember. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.